Something real is unfolding in the Middle East right now. Not a drill, not a movie, not a geopolitical hypothetical being debated in some think tank in Washington, D.C. This is the live, breathing, evolving reality of what happens when the most powerful military force in human history collides with a country that has spent 4 decades designing its entire military doctrine around one single purpose, making that collision as costly and uncertain as possible. Iran's claim of 450 Sejjil missiles locked and aimed at 4 U.S. nuclear carriers isn't just a headline. It is a window into the most consequential military confrontation America has faced in a generation. And most people in this country have no idea just how deep this rabbit hole actually goes, or what is truly at stake, not just for soldiers overseas, but for every single American sitting at home watching the price of oil climb and wondering why the world feels so unstable right now. Let's actually talk about what's happening, what it means, and why the story you're being told is only a fraction of the real one. In mid-March 2026, Iran deployed the Sejjil solid-fuel missile for the very first time in live combat conditions, and that moment should have stopped every American cold. Because the Sejjil is not just another name in a list of Iranian weapon systems. It is a solid-fuel, 2-stage medium-range ballistic missile that can launch within 10 to 15 minutes of receiving an order. The missiles are stored, fueled, and ready. The launcher fires, relocates, and can fire again from a new position. Think about what that actually means from a military planning perspective. A weapon you cannot easily destroy before it fires, that can move, that requires almost no preparation window, and that is now being used in an active war theater. That changes the mathematics of the entire engagement. Now let's zoom out and understand the full picture, because context is everything here. On February 28, 2026, following a large-scale assault by the United States and Israel, the Iranian armed forces issued radio warnings prohibiting all navigation through the Strait of Hormuz. This is the same strait through which roughly 20% of the world's oil supply flows every single day. That single act, not a ground invasion, not a nuclear weapon, not even a major battlefield victory, that single act of closing one narrow waterway sent energy markets into a convulsion. Brent crude prices surged significantly, briefly approaching $100 per barrel, and tanker traffic through the strait dropped by 90% in the first week of March 2026 alone. The International Energy Agency was forced to respond with the largest emergency reserve release in its history, all 32 member countries unanimously agreeing to release 400 million barrels of oil into the global market, more than twice the previous record set in 2022 after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So when people ask whether this Iran conflict is really America's problem, the answer is already written in the price at the gas pump. The Strait of Hormuz is not a foreign issue. It is an American economic lifeline being held at gunpoint, and Tehran knows exactly how to hold it. Now back to the Sejjil and what Iran is actually claiming. The number 450 being floated in connection with these missiles targeting US carriers is part of a broader Iranian deterrence signaling strategy that has been building for years. And to understand it properly, you have to understand the doctrine that Iran has built its entire military philosophy around. Iran's missile doctrine relies on mass, launching enough missiles to overwhelm defense systems through saturation. In a conflict, Iran would launch hundreds of ballistic missiles simultaneously from dispersed hardened launch sites, combined with cruise missiles and drones in complex multi-axis attacks. This is not guesswork. This is the publicly documented, repeatedly demonstrated strategy that Tehran has been refining for decades. Washington has surged naval and air assets into the region, building what officials describe as one of the largest concentrations of US firepower near Iran in years. And yet, here is the uncomfortable truth about what that firepower faces in this specific geography. The Navy grasps the reality of the circumstances, recognizing that it simply cannot sail into the strait without risking getting blown to pieces by Iran's missiles. Today, its carriers are stationed well outside the Gulf and the ranges of Iranian missiles. These steps have imposed additional costs on war prosecution, necessitating expensive and continuous aerial refueling operations. Read that again slowly. The most powerful navy ever assembled in human history cannot safely put its aircraft carriers inside the Persian Gulf. That is the strategic reality in April 2026, and it did not happen overnight. Back in the 1990s, when the US held a position of unquestioned global naval supremacy following the end of the Cold War, the Navy sailed its carriers into the Persian Gulf with impunity. But by the end of the 1990s, Iran had installed anti-ship missiles into concrete and steel-reinforced bunkers. giving it the ability to easily target any ships passing near the strait. The era of shore-based anti-access and area denial had arrived in the Persian Gulf. That was 3 decades ago. Iran has spent every single year since then deepening, expanding, and technologically upgrading that defensive and offensive architecture. In 2024 through 2026, Iran abandoned GPS signals, which are vulnerable to electronic warfare, in favor of the Chinese navigation system Beidou 3. The military signal of the Beidou system uses frequency hopping and encryption technology, ensuring 98% navigation reliability even under conditions of massive electronic warfare jamming. Thanks to this, Iranian missiles have achieved an accuracy of less than 5 to 10 meters. 5 to 10 meters. That is not a weapon system designed to terrorize civilians into submission. That is a precision instrument designed to hit specific targets, radar antennas, deck structures, control systems, on moving ships. And Iran has not been building this capability alone. Despite losses during the war with Israel in June 2025, Iran was able to quickly rebuild its arsenal to a level of approximately 2,000 to 2,500 missiles of various types. Russia has reportedly assisted Iran in upgrading its most dangerous missile variants. Materials used in solid-fuel missile production have moved from China to Iran in 2025. Russia has also assisted Iran in upgrading the lethality of its most dangerous Khorramshahr medium-range ballistic missiles. This is not a regional power acting alone. This is a nation embedded in a network of strategic relationships with 2 other major nuclear powers, both of whom have direct interests in seeing American military primacy checked in the Gulf region. Now let's address the carrier vulnerability question head-on, because this is the part that mainstream American media consistently fails to explain honestly. Iran's answer to American military superiority is dispersion, redundancy, and volume. Many small launch points, many cheap shooters, and enough mid-tier systems to complicate every phase of a US air-sea campaign. Think about the asymmetry here. A US aircraft carrier costs approximately $13 billion to build. The missiles that could theoretically threaten it cost a fraction of that per unit. Even if only a small percentage of a massive Iranian salvo penetrated the layered American missile defenses, the cost-exchange ratio is catastrophically unfavorable for Washington, and every defense analyst who looks at this honestly knows it. The fastest way Iran changes the war's geometry is mining. Open source and intelligence-linked estimates commonly place Iran's stockpile in the thousands, often cited in the 5,000 to 6,000 range, including bottom and influence mines that are slow to clear and disproportionately disruptive. And here is a detail that should disturb every American taxpayer. Despite discovering its vulnerability to Iranian mines during Operation Earnest Will in the Iran-Iraq War 40 years ago, the Navy today still has no credible anti-mine ships to mitigate the threat. 40 years. The United States has known about this gap for 4 decades and has not closed it. That is not incompetence. That is a choice. And it reflects the way Washington's military-industrial establishment has historically prioritized offensive capability over the unglamorous defensive work of mine countermeasures. The Sejjil itself deserves more sustained attention than it typically receives in American coverage. The Sejjil is described as an 18-meter medium-range ballistic missile powered by 2-stage solid propellant. It reportedly carries a 700-kilogram warhead and has a maximum range of 2,000 kilometers. The Sejjil enters the atmosphere at extremely high speeds, testing the limits of sophisticated missile defense systems like Israel's Arrow 3 and US Patriot batteries. The sheer velocity and trajectory of the Sejjil are designed to saturate and overwhelm even the most advanced radar and interceptor networks. When you combine that with the solid fuel advantage, the fact that these missiles need almost no preparation time and are extraordinarily difficult to destroy on the ground before launch, you begin to understand why its combat debut in March 2026 sent shockwaves through defense establishments from Washington to Tel Aviv. Now, there is a critically important question that nobody in the mainstream political conversation seems willing to ask directly. How did we get here? How did the United States arrive at a moment in 2026 where 4 of its nuclear-capable aircraft carriers are positioned in the region where Iran is actively firing missiles at American-linked targets, where American service members have already died, and where global oil markets are in crisis, all while most of the American public was given almost no meaningful preparation for the possibility that this confrontation was coming? The answer requires stepping back from the immediate military details and looking at the longer arc of policy decisions. Iran warned for years, in explicit and documented terms, that certain actions would trigger escalation. Prior to the outbreak of hostilities, Iran explicitly warned relevant parties that any attack would trigger both vertical and horizontal escalation. One example was the letter from Iran's permanent mission to the United Nations dated February 19, 2026. These warnings were not secret, they were formal diplomatic communications, and yet the decision was made and the consequences are now unfolding in real time, and it is ordinary American families who will feel the economic shockwaves of higher oil prices, disrupted shipping, and a military engagement with no obvious clean exit. The impressive surge of US military might into the Middle East has yet to compel Iran to meet President Trump's demands that it negotiate an agreement that finally ends its nuclear program, ballistic missile arsenals, support for proxies, and oppression of its own citizens. Ahead of talks between the two countries, Iranian Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei threatened that more dangerous than the American warship is the weapon that can send it to the bottom of the sea. That is not empty rhetoric from a regime that is cornered and desperate. That is the measured public statement of a government that believes it has invested sufficiently in asymmetric deterrence to make direct conflict with America genuinely costly in ways that matter to American domestic politics. Unlike the 12-day war that the US and Israel waged on Iran in June 2025, the killing of Khamenei appears to have convinced Tehran that the clash is a battle for the Islamic Republic's very survival. In Tehran's narrative, delayed or restrained retaliation risks being seen as weakness and an invitation to further attacks. This is the most dangerous psychological dynamic in international conflict. When a government believes it is fighting for its existence, the calculus of rational cost-benefit analysis breaks down. Deterrence theory, the entire framework on which American military strategy in the region rests, depends on the assumption that the adversary will respond rationally to signals of overwhelming force. But an adversary that believes it has nothing left to lose by escalating and everything to lose by backing down does not behave according to that framework. U.S. Central Command Commander Admiral Brad Cooper stated that Iranian ballistic missile attacks have decreased by 90% since the war began, and drone attacks are down 83%. That sounds like progress, and in one narrow tactical sense it is. But what it also tells you is that after sustained intensive American and Israeli strikes targeting missile infrastructure across Iran, the IDF had struck hundreds of missile launch sites across Iran and rendered over 300 ballistic missile launchers inoperable since February 28th, and yet Iran is still launching, still firing, still absorbing punishment and continuing to generate threat. That level of resilience in a missile program is not accidental. It is the product of decades of deliberate investment in hardened facilities, dispersed storage, and redundant launch capability. Iran's doctrine emphasizes mobility, dispersion of transporter-erector launcher units, rapid displacement after launch, and mixed-wave attack strategies that combine ballistic and cruise systems to saturate and complicate defensive responses. Solid fuel platforms like the Sejjil reduce launch preparation exposure, while cruise missiles force layered tracking challenges. And underneath all of this is a naval strategy specifically built around the Strait of Hormuz choke point, combining missiles, mines, submarines, and fast attack craft into a layered defensive web that makes the cost of sustained American naval operations in confined Gulf waters extremely high. In a conflict defined by escalation management and political thresholds, Tehran's objective is clear: not a decisive battlefield victory, but the creation of sustained operational friction that forces Washington to reconsider the price of prolonged intervention in the Gulf. That sentence deserves to be read very carefully because it is the key to understanding everything that is happening right now. Iran is not trying to defeat the United States militarily. Iran knows it cannot do that. What Iran is doing, what it has always been doing, is raising the cost of American engagement high enough that the political will to sustain that engagement eventually collapses. This is the same playbook that worked in Lebanon in 1983. It is the same dynamic that shaped the withdrawal from Somalia in 1993. It is the logic that ultimately drove the exits from Iraq and Afghanistan. And Tehran has studied all of those cases with great care. Iran has reportedly been in talks with China to acquire the CM-302 supersonic anti-ship cruise missiles, which military analysts describe as a complete game-changer if transferred, because these missiles are very difficult to intercept. Add that potential capability to an already layered threat environment that includes thousands of naval mines, submarines, fast attack craft, and coastal anti-ship missile batteries, and the picture of what US carriers face in the broader Gulf region becomes significantly more complex than any single headline about 450 Sejjil missiles can capture. The number 450, the specific claim about nuclear carriers, the specific attribution and honesty, These details may be subject to the usual uncertainty and inflation that surrounds wartime information from all sides of any conflict, but what is not uncertain, what is verified by satellite imagery, by US military press conferences, by market data, and by the undeniable reality of an active armed conflict, is that the broader strategic situation those numbers point to is entirely real. America is in a shooting war with Iran. Iranian missiles are reaching American-linked targets. American service members are dying. Global oil markets are in crisis. And 4 US carriers are positioned at the edges of a geography specifically designed over decades to threaten their survival. The question that actually matters for every American watching this unfold is not whether the number 450 is precisely accurate. The question is what comes next, who decided this was worth it, and whether the people making those decisions have a plan for what happens the morning after the bombs stop falling, because in the Middle East, the morning after is always where the real war begins.